Hi, my name is Prashant Doshi, student of Cloud Computing course at Howard University Extension School conducted by Professor Zoran. Today we are going to discuss about simple workflow service and we are going to see how I have implemented this in my application. We will also review the key aspects of simple workflow service framework. So what are the scenarios where we can use simple workflow service? Frankly speaking, it can be used in all the workflows, but it is specifically useful if you have to create a workflow which is scalable. Sometimes our workflow requires to run tasks that are distributed across multiple data centers. It's a very good scenario to use simple workflow service. Sometimes we have long running tasks and we can again use this to create a workflow which has got long running tasks like data modeling or analytics tasks. We can also monitor and track the different tasks using this framework. So let's deep dive into a simple workflow service framework and understand what are the key components and how it works and how it solves our problem. A simple workflow service framework is a framework and tool which helps build workflows and run them on the cloud environment. You can run the jobs either sequentially or in parallel as the case may be. The application can be divided into two parts. One that runs in the cloud environment of AWS cloud and the other that can run either in cloud or in premise. So the framework itself resides in the cloud. It stores history and has got decision task list and activity task list. We'll discuss that later. Application with CloudWatch can create alarms. And we have then actors. There are three actors in this framework which actually helps to run the task. One is the workflow executor, which is responsible for executing or kickstarting the workflow. Then the activities, and then we have activity host application which actually performs the task. So what are the other components? One of the first component that is called domain. Domain is like a boundary within which a workflow works. You can have multiple domains and you can have multiple workflows in a domain, but a workflow running in one domain cannot interact with the workflow that is running in another domain. Task list. We have two types of task lists. One is called the decision task list and another is called activity task list. Task lists are the way to organize and associate the tasks with a workflow. If you want to schedule a task, you have to schedule the task in a task list. Long polling. Long polling is a mechanism which helps to communicate between different components of simple workflow service framework. Say an example, if a host, a worker application sends a polling request to the framework will check whether there is any polling task associated with the decision list. If there is a task, then it will send the data to the workflow worker, and if there is no task, then it will wait for 60 seconds to check whether the task comes. If the task doesn't come within 60 seconds, it will close the connection. History. History is maintained by the framework for all the workflows, right from the start of the execution of the workflow till its end. Events. Events are records whenever there is a change of state in a workflow. For example, an activity task completing and returning the set of results to the framework. It is recorded as an event. In fact, scheduling a task is also an event. How my application is structured. In my application or my workflow is trying to load multiple files from local server to an S3 bucket, and then we need to process that file. So I've implemented a workflow for this scenario. The first task is to load the file from my application or my local server to S3, and then it kickstarts another process of processing the file. This is my application architecture, and it depicts the various components that are used in my application and how they communicate with workflow API. To start the workflow, I have a workflow executor which sends a request to SWF API to kickstart the workflow. The workflow workers which keeps pulling for the task, once receives the response from the API that you can start this workflow, it starts viewing different activities. So it checks, this workflow worker checks whether there are files in the host machine. It sends the data to the upload file activity worker to start loading the file from the source directory. Puts the file in the S3 bucket. It sends the response back to the API. Once the workflow worker API notes that from the history that this task is complete, it schedules another task to read the file from an S3 bucket. This keeps on going till all the files are read and processed. These two activities are performed asynchronously. Apart from the framework, AWS also provides a management console through which we can do different activities. We will go through the management console later and see what are the activities that can be performed using this console. What are the features of, so you can run this task asynchronously. You can have multiple instances of host application or workflow host application. You can integrate this workflow with cloud. You can configure multiple decision task or activity task list. You can instantiate a child workflow, and also you can monitor your SWF dashboard. So here we take the code snippet. So you see we have first the activity interface. This interface is decorated with activities and register activity registration options annotations. Activity takes version as a part of a parameter. This version along with the activity task list name is used to register this activity with SWF framework. The timeout options helps the framework to track different activities and track the status of the activity. You can define multiple methods in this interface. Next, we have price upload workflow, which actually defines that this is a workflow, and this interface is used to register a workflow with the framework using a workflow annotation. And then we have workflow registration option, which defines the very different timeouts to keep track of the workflow, and a task list which the workflow worker will be polling for the decision tasks. It should have at least one method with an execute annotation, and the execute annotation can be decorated to only one method. We have a get state method as well to know the state of the workflow at any given point of time. This is the implementation class. Now, since I am scheduling those activities asynchronously, there's a place where I need to transfer the data from activity 1 to activity 2. For this purpose, I have used a settable method in the overloaded upload file methods, which is the entry point for the workflow. And then I have used a .chain method to capture the data returned by the previous activity. Then I create an instance of scheduling options and assign a task list to it, and then I schedule this activity. This is the activity host, which creates the instance of an activity worker, and then this activity worker implements my actual activity. Then I have a workflow host, which is responsible for the workflow worker. It instantiates the workflow worker and adds the workflow implementation and starts the workflow worker. This is the workflow execution starter, which is responsible for starting my workflow by passing all the objects and creating an instance of my workflow client. Some of the important and supporting classes is a config property, which we'll see in the code. and then AWS Client Manager, which is responsible for providing configuration details and connecting with AWS services like instantiating S3 client and SWF client objects in this application. Now let's go to the code. So this is a config property which defines my credentials. This is path to the directory where my config file for the AWS credentials are stored. What is the profile credential name I am using to communicate with the AWS? What is my workflow domain where I will be creating my workflow? This is already created using the management console. What is the source directory, from the directory from which where I will copy all the files? Then the name of the bucket where the files will be stored. Now let's look at the S3 bucket. Currently you see there is no bucket that is being created with the given name. So as soon as the activity worker instantiates, it will also create a bucket in the S3. And we will see the dashboard. This is the dashboard where you can manage your domains. So these are the domains that I have created. If you want to create a new domain, you need to click on the register new button. Now let's start our application. So this is where I'm starting my host application. You see an object of a generic workflow worker is created by the framework. Now I'm starting my activity host. You'll see the object of a generic activity worker being instantiated. Now I will kickstart my workflow. You see it has copied all the files and it has started processing the file and calling the other activity of processing the file. This activity has read all the files. You can see the output of the files getting transferred. Now we will check our console. We'll refresh the console. We'll go to the bucket, and these are the files that are loaded. And now let's look at the console. In the dashboard, you will see the execution that has just happened, and then you will see the workflow types that are being registered and the activity types that are being registered. You can also see how many executions, what is the status, what are the active executions and what are the closed executions. You can also look at the closed executions, and you can see the events that are associated with an execution and the list of activities that are called and what are the status of these activities. Thank you.